Thing on. How's that? All right, well, folks, here to talk about Cascadia, kind of going through from when the initial idea happened to production. So it really is a, hey, here's what went on, here's how it went, and kind of going through everything. One thing I do want to say is I've tried to keep the content somewhat light while covering the full process, especially the parts that I was more directly involved in. So hey, whatever you need to keep your questions, I'll do questions at the end. But I anticipate we'll have a good bit of time for questions to go into the parts of it that you all care more about, would like to know more about. So first, for those who don't know, who am I? Well, first off, I've always been a builder. Even when I was a kid, I built things. It started off with a lot of physical stuff until I discovered computer programming around age 13 and was like, oh, I can sit in my chair and not move and use my brain and make things happen. So that's how I became a software engineer, college for that. I'm also a sports player and fan. I don't know how much this really impacts, the board game stuff that I do and all of that, but I think it's very interesting in the industry how some are almost anti-sports, and yet you also have a strong bit of pretty traditional sports fans. I love it back and forth. I play basketball and I watch soccer. Somehow over the years, I've slowly migrated towards this interesting split. Another thing is I moved around a lot as a kid. My dad worked for DuPont and we would move to a new place for about 3 years, give or take, as he would do some new work, and then we'd often move back to Delaware. That's where DuPont's headquarters was, and so that's where I grew up in Newark, mostly. And it's all on the East Coast, really. North Carolina, Niagara Falls area, New York, along with Delaware. Except for a short stint in Iran. We lived in Isfahan at the end of the 70s, leaving right before the revolution. Back to that very briefly at the very end. Had a big impact on me, as people talking about here a moment ago who have known. And I moved to college. For years. Other things, my immediate family is pretty large. I have 5 wonderful sisters. All are younger than me. If you're going to be the only boy, I recommend that. When I tell some people I have that many sisters, they kind of go, oh my God, that must have been a hard childhood. I'm like, well, I was the oldest, so I think it was a little easier. My chosen family is small. My partner and her son became my son. So there are 3 of us, unless you count the dogs. There are 3 dogs of varying sizes and ages, and that's the rest of the family. I played some games growing up. I played Monopoly, of course. I played Scrabble. My dad really loves Scrabble, so that's the thing that I played quite a bit. And also played Pitch. That was our family card game from my dad's side. Recently learned that Pitch, they believe, was invented in the 1600s. I really had no idea it was that old. I expected it to be a 1900s, a 20th century game, but apparently not. Let's see what else. Oh, gin. Actually, more from my mom's side of the family. Had some gin players. By the time I was in college, though, I moved to video games. And I played SimCity and Civilization. Sid Meier's Civilization is my favorite video game of all time. As a builder, that might not be a surprise. SimCity was pretty strong too. Although I eventually moved to playing a lot of Halo of various kinds. Kind of went away from that. It was easier, and it was definitely the online experience that ended up really drawing me into that as a regular thing. I returned to board games with my chosen family recently after meeting my partner, and son was 9 at the time. I actually had learned a few things. Well, what is this thing, Catan, and all, so I went out and did research and found some games that would work well. I thought 9-year-old, because he played a few things. He played Castle Panic, and probably a bunch of others that I was less aware of, and came home with Catan and Carcassonne. Carcassonne is a game I play to this day. Catan is a game that we would play 3 times in a night, not with the 9-year-old. that kind of after he had finished the third game, and I to start one. I'm also very lucky to have a regular game group. This was certainly a big deal during the pandemic. So my sister-in-law and her partner at the time lived a quarter mile away from us. So I get to regularly play games at the table with four, or occasionally if my son's there, five people, which I know during the pandemic, but I was very lucky for that. And they also like to play test my games, or at least they pretend they like to play test my games. So they're almost always the first line of defense in that. And in fact, my first prototype game I call CC game. It's a civilization building game. CC is how my code names for my game started off. They're just a group of letters, which usually don't mean much of anything. But CC was actually civilization in Catan. It was kind of thinking what I liked about those games and creating something. Finally did a full play test with the family after working on it off and on. Did it, came up with something playable, and we played it. First time we got through a game, it took 6. There are a lot of design flaws with that game, because this is a game that probably needed to put like 90 minutes on a box if you were trying to sell it. So yeah, a lot of things I needed to fix, but also that my family played that game for 6 hours. Around 2 hours, it was like, okay, we'll play one more round. And like, yeah, okay, yeah, we'll try one more. I think we were on our second or third beer by that point, and that's about when the game got fun. Somehow, despite it taking 6 hours, the game got fun for several hours, despite it being there. And so I had a couple of reactions to that. One, I think I can do this. Two, I had a lot of work to do on this one. And that was about the point where I thought, I think I'd like to actually try to get a game published. And so I have a lot to learn on that. And you know what? This big game may not be the thing for me to go to a publisher with. So out of that was born Tabriz, which is, a worker movement Euro game that was my first game signed, just funded this fall, and probably be out later this year. And then eventually that led to Cascadia, of course, but that was really several steps along the way. All right. So next part. What is Cascadia, or why am I here? So Cascadia is a family-weight game that plays in about 45 minutes. It's a double tile laying game where you basically lay one set of tiles and another set of tiles, although we call it tokens, on top, wildlife and habitats. It was my third game signed, but it was the first one published. I've told the story many times, but just so you know, the idea to publication time with Cascadia is something I will never replicate for a variety of reasons. It was very fast. The game is a product of the Flat Out Games collab, which I'll talk a little more about, and I know some of you know. A whole presentation. We're very Flat Out collab, and you'll find the principals talking about it. And give a lot of details about how the collab works. It's an excellent model for a company to create. I don't think anyone has actually replicated that model. There's some similar ones. Cascadia was initially funded by Flat Out on Kickstarter, and they have a publishing partner that they often have for their games, and Cascadia was the second one under that partnership with AEG. So AEG is responsible for store distribution and the signing of international deals. I'll explain some importance of that later. And they do some other things. They actually help with the manufacturing process and other things. They have, a company like AEG has some very good relationships with manufacturers in various parts that they're able to take advantage of. And importantly, for the whole why am I here part 2, is that it's published in Germany by Cosmos. Cosmos, one of the larger board game companies, most respected in Germany, came very close to winning a Spiel the year before with Robin Hood. And Cosmos actually sought out Cascadia, not the other way around. So they were a very, very important partner. Okay, so to talk about Cascadia itself. I've told this story, so some of you may have heard it, but in end of April, beginning of May 2019, I was on vacation. That was when Peter McPherson's Tiny Towns came out. So I keep physical notebooks, I keep digital notebooks in OneNote. I have one notebook that is just game ideas, and it's to jot whatever down. Sometimes it's a sentence that sits there for 2 years. Other times you'll see follow-ons, things. Here, this is what I read on the plane. So, laying foundation, a tile or tiles, and the second is a tile. And I give some kind of examples of what it could be. That idea, combined with reflecting on the scoring cards, specifically from Tiny Towns, the variable scoring cards and the different patterns, is really what led me to think of Cascadia. And so I thought, well, I'd like to do something with variable scoring. So I was like, how can I make this like very generic idea something truly interesting? I things very, very quickly to solve. I don't know that I've ever heard anyone use the term solo test outside of me before. And I know for some designers, this probably is just not a thing. For most types of games, I can sit there and play 2 or 3 or 4 players and go around and around and do it again and again and again and learn a lot. When I design a game where that can't work well because like hidden information is key, I actually get slowed down dramatically. This is definitely one of my key tools, and it was very easy with Cascadia. As those who know the game, it's very much towards the multiplayer solitaire avenue, so it becomes very easy. There's no hidden information, not really a lot of direct competition. You don't really spend much of your time messing up your opponents, so it's very easy for me to go quickly. And if I'd had the solo mode that Sean Stankiewicz eventually designed for it, I could have gone even faster because that works pretty well. So another thing that I wrote down here was the version of this that came out very quickly had a fixed board. Somewhat ironically, because I didn't do it because of this, it's very similar to Calico at that point in that regard. It had a board and you had to fit them on there. And there were only 4 wildlife and 4 habitats initially. And so from that, I was able to determine a lot of stuff worked, even though the game as a whole had worked well. It was enough for me to keep working on this full board. I say first playtest happened 4 weeks later. Something I don't remember, but I very much remember the playtest I had with the EGX convention in Washington. The game was called Lands and Creatures, and that's what it was called all the way until after it was a final name. Quick aside, Lands and Creatures was one of the, I think, 3 or 4 names that we were deciding for up until the very end. So there was actually a very real possibility it could have been called Lands and Creatures. Little on the nose, I'll admit, but there were those who liked that name the best. So at this point, the game was played in 2 phases. And this is really interesting because you don't see a lot of games like this, and in that way it's kind of cool, but it also leads to 2 very different experiences in the same game. And so the first one was drafting and laying all of your habitats with no wildlife on them whatsoever. And then the second one was doing the wildlife. So you very much had a phase where you were setting up one for the other. And it really meant that every turn was largely straightforward. And, it worked. Played, we scored well, the person who won felt like they did the best. This is, all very, very good. But you'll see my next quote on there, 30 minutes of chill. Like the folks liked it. I don't think that meant a lot to anyone. Because, they like the pattern building, they like this, but there's not really enough tension in this for a game at that point. Playtest also showed that this system rewarded the person who and math out in their head what the best solution was. Real dynamism, yes, you had to draft randomness, but the way the draft was, there also wasn't a lot of tension in that. Likely you can get something you need, especially early on in a phase. If I set all this up, now I need, early on it didn't even matter. I'm playing to all 4, in this case, wildlife, so if I can't get the elk yet, So what? I'll take this and put it where it needs, and eventually I know I'm behind on elephant as soon as they come up and you can grab them. Again, fairly simple, too simple. In the end, people enjoyed it, and I think the core idea, I felt like after this was essentially a winner. And so I was like, okay, I got this. I've got a lot of work to do, but again, keep working on it. It was a lot of iterating. And really, we're talking about the first part of this. This isn't really exactly chronological order here. Was a few weeks, and then maybe a month of time that I'm talking about for this. So at this point, simple in that there were some number of habitat tiles or some number of wildlife tokens, and you take one game, which probably realize is actually a key part of the tension. So this is an improvement. It's setting up. It's adding a little more tension. Adding the fifth wildlife was another one of those kind of big moments, because up until that point, there was no one wildlife depended on another. And in fact, there was a little bit, but it was actually kind of broken. It was something like hawks scored based on how they were next to salmon, because they were going to eat the salmon. But you'll see things like this in games. It's very odd to have type A rely on type B, and nothing else rely on anything else. So it really means that A and B become kind of special. That can be good if everything else has its own special thing. But in this case, it was just like, no, you need them, or you need to do it really well, and no good. So that's where the foxes came in. Except they weren't yet foxes. They were gorillas. Remember, the game was not Cascadia. The game was Lands and Creatures. And that's where, had one that relied on what wildlife was placed. And it changed the dynamic of the puzzle. And so before, you're like, oh, I just need I'm going to put this line of fish at the time, like around here, okay, good, here. And suddenly we had a piece in here that said, well, if you map all those out separately, great, and then you'll not know what to do with the foxes you're forced to take. And you know what? They actually have the maximum point scoring is a fox, right? You can generally score 5 points on a fox and play it perfectly. It's very hard to get close to that on the other wildlife. So this is not to say you have to play foxes in Cascadia. There are other strategies, but they are pretty important on the average. And so it really torqued the puzzle a lot in a very, very, very good way and added a set of tension. And like I'm mentioning this just to say that, in many ways I feel like Cascadia was like, oh, look, here's this double tiling thing. Here, idea, boom, game. But that was just to prove a concept. And it took many little steps along the way before it became a game. And I can go to some of my other designs and point out that, oh, that happened. There's a step, cliff. I don't know what's next. I haven't been able to figure out the next step. I think maybe there's still something good there, but I can't seem to get beyond this point. Whereas with Cascadia, I seem to continually hit things and say, oh, yep, I got the next bit here, and we added it. So lots of playtesting over that. The middle of June was Origins at that time convention, and that was the first time that I pitched it. I pitched it to a few companies. I don't remember a lot. No bites on it. One interesting story, which I won't mention names or companies, that was kind of funny though, is a reminder that publishers all have their logic and reasoning for why they want certain kinds of games. They describe. You may have heard Joe Wiggins talk about certain things from BoardGameTales.com, now All Play, that they just require, and it's there, and you need to hit those, and it's very straightforward. But there are others that just like in the head of the people making the decisions, what it is. So one that happened here is I got a meeting with a very small board game company, and he said, but I can't publish it. Why? You're going to ask that question a lot. And he pointed to a table nearby of a different publisher, and he said, my friend X over here is just coming out with a game that is too similar. Okay, so I went over and he kind of described it, but I went over and looked at the game, and it was just funny because I was like, the only thing similar about these games is you play hex habitats and you place wildlife in places around. There was nothing else about that game that was remotely similar to Cascadia. But because it was a friend, because of these similarities, it was like, no. I can't argue with that logic. I get it, but it's a thing to keep in mind when you're pitching to companies is that, you know, he told me, but a ton of them aren't even going to tell you that. They're going to have their own. Flat out signing. Sean Stankiewicz, and at that time, Sean was part of this. I saw them regularly. You know, I saw Sean probably almost once a week. So Sean had play tested the game and gone all through of that. And he had then made sure Molly and Rob saw it. Molly also had a chance to play test it. It was one of those things I always remember. We went to our friendly local game store and they were closing in 20 minutes. And so Sean said, you need to play this now, Molly. And it's like, we have 20 minutes. Like, okay, let's do it, 20 minutes. So we literally played a game of Cascadia in 20 minutes, rushing through it. And I was like, oh, this isn't going to present this well to me. Even in the offered and offered at this point. So but as I get closer to Gen Con, you know, and talking with Marlene and other friends, is like I realized I actually want to work with these folks on something. And here I'm getting the great opportunity, and they're all incredibly bright at you know, design and thinking through games. Is like, yeah, I feel like I want to go through this process. Let's do it. Or maybe I was just getting lazy because I didn't want to prepare to pitch at Gen Con, because sometimes that is a lot of work. So before who's going to publish it, I know the process, we're just going to set it aside. But I was like, I'm not going to do that now. So I did. Put it about a month later. Sean and I sat down for a design session at my place, and we made a lot of little tweaks to the game, and you know, went through all of that and brainstormed new ideas, you know, for what we might consider adding. The biggest thing we did was try removing the board. So that was one of the things that's mentioned. We still had the board. I still had a board on that, which was very similar to Calico's that restricted it. And the idea had come up multiple times, and I basically said, I'm pretty sure that's the right thing to do. And then when they signed it, I was like, put it aside, I'm not gonna worry about it. And so we sat down and we literally just changed nothing except removing the board, playing freeform. And it was one of those weird moments, again, it just worked better. Like I couldn't even criticize anything about, oh no, we'll have to change this, we'll have to change that. It just worked better. The board was serving as a restriction, but it turns out that all the little design decisions made along the way about how things scored actually introduced this new set of restrictions. So you can come in and say, well, what's to keep someone from creating, you know, a habitat like this? And I'm like, well, I've had playtesters since then do that, and none of them has scored over about 75. So it's interesting that although I didn't do that for a while, I think the lesson, you know, is still, when you have a simple idea for something that might help your game, and it's relatively easy to try, just try it. I had a bit of a luxury in that I just gotten the game signed flat out, so I wasn't worrying about stuff. But if that hadn't happened, I shouldn't have been putting that off, because literally that would take 10 minutes, maybe 20 to go through a play test. And it was so obvious that even if I'd just done that on my own, I would have realized it right away. So the one bit that I have next here is about the theme. So it's at this point it was still lands of creatures. I think it was gorillas. I think it was still fish. It was bears. Maybe it was cougars, although I don't think so. It was kind of this random set, and some vague like fish, and some that were more specific like gorillas here. And through this process, I was starting to think, this should really be Pacific Northwest theme. And so again, this is put aside. So we talked about it there, and then we talked about it with Molly and Rob, and this is one of these decisions that almost wasn't a decision. Just as soon as it was talked about it, everyone went, well, of course, that's what we're going to do. I can tell you there was a similar thing I was not part of in the naming of Calico. It's like there's some decisions, like when the name Calico was mentioned for some reason, like they've told me, there really wasn't much discussion. It just like, oh, it means this and it means that, and it's one word and it's simple and there's no game with this. Like, that sounds really good. And so I think this is the same thing. It's like, hey, all but one of us technically live in the Pacific Northwest. Rob's a little farther up east and north in Canada, and it just really fit. And every one of us have a love of the outdoors out there and the scenery, so it really came pretty quickly. And so then I'm like, okay, given that that Sobel is illustrated Calico, she's gonna do this game, right? So we're gonna ask her. So then I actually get a message from Beth, like, I had met Beth briefly. She actually play tested Debris once. She says, I'm excited to be doing your game. And I'm like, I think this is the other way around. Like, I've watched you illustrate so many of the games I love, and now you're gonna do my game. So yeah, that was great. I'm so happy that worked out. So from that point, that's great. We got kind of the basics, and eventually Flat Out got around, had their Calico Kickstarter and did well. But from then on, we had a lot of like continued development. So I've mentioned a bunch of stuff. There's a whole lot of stuff that I've left out here, because there's a number of more critical changes and decisions that really make Cascadia the game it is, and they happened over the next year or so. And there are a bunch of them happened all the way up to even to the start of the Kickstarter. And so I've got a bit of a list here. The dual habitat tiles are something that we talked about early on, because we wanted to make the habitats mean something more than just dictating what wildlife could go on. Up until this point, that's really all they did. If it was this, it meant these were the possible wildlife combinations that show up. Well, maybe we can have multiple on the tiles. And that's where we did it. We said, well, we'll just start with 2. And as soon as we started with 2, we're like, that's all we need. Like this really changes and adds a secondary puzzle to it. And so it's kind of a no-brainer. At a certain point, the keystone tiles became that they scored a point, because it's like, well, these are just significantly worse tiles because they lock you into something. And sometimes it won't matter. Sometimes you'll be like, I'll take this. Hopefully this works out. And so at one point, we just, well, we'll just give folks a point for doing that. So it kind of balances out. And it worked reasonably well. One thing you don't see a lot with Cascadia, unless you go back to the very early playtesting pictures, is wilds. And so there were wild tiles, wild habitat tiles, and wild wildlife tokens, just 1 each per player. And this is just it's an interesting mechanic to talk about for a sec, because they're good. I like playing with the wilds that were in there, and they may come back in some form someday, because they're pretty cool. But as cool as they are as a mechanic, the one thing they dictated was, you need to play the wild really well. You can all have good games, and if one person nails their wild, then you just do okay. The person who nails it playing that wild is going to win, because the way they work was just that important. They weren't just wilds that you can treat as anything. It was that every bit of scoring, you can treat the wild differently for that bit of scoring. And it's actually a very cool mechanic. And we go through it, and this is like, this is a phrase they talk about that, I think most people don't like them, like kill your darlings, but it's like there's a point where you have to recognize something that you really like and that is really good may not be the best thing for the game. And so how do you take it out? And so, we go through that and we talk about that sometimes with other designers after their play tests. I give Emma Larkins in particular a lot of credit after one of the play tests for being very, very strong about it and saying, yep, this is a cool mechanic, I love it, but you need it. It's not helping the game right now. And I think at some point after that Sean and I had another discussion, maybe with Molly and Rob as well, about it. Went, yep, let's try it without it and see if we got enough. Again, the wilds were probably very important early in the game before a lot of these things came along. And so it's another thing is that sometimes your game evolves beyond the initial mechanics and you just don't need them anymore. They fill the role, but you've actually filled in things that mean that role is no longer so necessary and you can remove them. If I tried to remove them like 9 months earlier or whatever, it probably would have caused a lot of problems. At this point, it was smooth. Just removed them. It was like, oh yeah, the game's still there. The tension's still there. But I don't think we've lost much of anything except you don't need to focus on this one quirky, interesting mechanic. So, there's a list of other things here. Probably one other one worth a little bit of talking about is the paired draft. And related to that is the nature tokens. Some of you may be familiar with AEG's Larkstone House. So they have a house that used to be in Orange County, and now it's in Las Vegas, it's a place where they do a lot of their playtesting and development and all of that stuff. And the Flat Out folks were there with Cascadia playing with AEG. So talking about possibly partnering on that eventually. And there was a lot of good things about this game, but we're still lacking some tension. And what it boiled down to is the draft was still pretty darn simple in how you took things. And so out of that came the paired draft. I think that was something they talked about down there at the Larkstone House, and then they messaged me about, we're thinking about this, and I went off and thought about it, figured it out, and it was another big moment that took a very multiplayer solitaire game that had a certain level of challenge and just added the right level, like next step of challenge into that. The nature tokens came out of that because the downside of the paired draft is you can end up with those situations like, I hate every option out there. It's bad for me in some way. And that wasn't a feeling we wanted in this game. There are certainly games that have that is part of it, and I would not knock that. But the nature token gave you a way to game you can mitigate here instead. That actually is very well. Some tokens early, so I have it. So yeah, the last two things on here: solo mode, achievements and scenarios. Sean designed the solo mode. It is, I will say, it's very nice. Yeah, you have to be aware of the differences in the draft and how that would impact anything you play tested. But the whole playing into your environment and everything is identical. And so I no longer needed to do the 2 or 3 players most of the time. I just play solo mode. No reason to go through those extras. I can get to a fully filled out environment much more quickly and see if that scoring card I'm trying out actually works. Yeah. And achievements and scenarios is interesting. So one, I didn't design anything on the solo mode. Sean did that. Achievements and scenarios, they had done that for Calico, and so they were going to do them for Cascadia. And I jumped in and helped with that. It was very, very fascinating. But what I didn't know until after working on it for a bit is this came from Rob Melvin saying, video games have these things. And so it really was much more directly inspired by video games. The achievements and scenarios are interesting because the number of people that actually use the sales of Cascadia. But the folks that use those, or the folks that play solo, they're passionate and they're going to talk about it. That's not because more people play it, but they're very passionate about it. So it definitely is a big help for your game. So all of this is going kind of like according to plan, if you will. Went to PAX Unplugged 2019, first time I got to demo the game at a convention. We had some great demoers, and it was a lot of fun, and it was just moving up. Calico was marketed based on in-convention, touch with the consumers, lots of showing people the game, talking about the game, all of that. And so the plan was very, very similar for Cascadia to move on with that. And then the pandemic hit. And it was pretty quickly that they realized there was going to be no physical conventions before this Kickstarter. And so, I had to kind of scramble on that and figure out what to do about it. And I have to give the whole Flat Out team a lot of credit, especially Molly Johnson, who I know drove a lot of this work to pivot to virtual conventions, pivot to more different ways of advertising online, getting word of mouth going. Because we went into the Kickstarter a little scared. Like, we haven't been able to do the things you all did for Calico that made it such a success. And Calico funded over $200,000, and I think we felt like we need to be around there. We need to be around there. So, I think thanks to a lot of thinking about that and going through the work, we were able to get through that, and Flat Out did a great job with that, and we ended up funding a little over $270,000 instead, so we increased it by quite a bit. A little bit, despite the Kickstarter presenting what looks like a finalized game, I think we all know that Kickstarters vary in what you're seeing smoke and mirrors versus are you actually seeing a real game. Cascadia was, from a overall component standpoint, pretty close to being, this is what we want. But there's a lot of steps to go there to get those materials to the final bit. And so I've started kind of going down, what are the next things that are happening? At this point, as part of the Flat Out collab, I'm involved in some of these and some of them and observing what's going on. But getting a game off the door, one of the things that requires a ton of it, I think a lot of people don't realize depending on what they're kind of doing. Reviewing materials, like every bit of text, every icon, every gap, everything, here. It's amazing how easily you can fool yourself into thinking this card looks perfect. It's got everything. Unless you're totally trained at such reviewing, you're probably wrong on at least 1 out of 4. And it can be shocking. I've had something happen with a game recently where after files were sent out, we got to think back, oh, guess what? So-and-so looked at the card. Look at this. See how the scoring is listed out. Does that make sense? You look at it and you go, crap, it's missing something. Like the entire example has a fault. It's not right. And that escaped 4 or 5 people looking at that card. And so getting all those details right is difficult. Publishing companies that have a good record at this probably have very good people, that do that and know that, and more importantly, probably processes that go through it. And so that's definitely something to keep in mind if you are going to be doing a Kickstarter or you have a small company doing a Kickstarter. You're going to want to budget a lot of time for that and expect things to have to change even up to the last minute. Then you get into things like manufacturing quotes. You got to do the file creation for everything. Every piece has a file. It has what the manufacturer requires of you and all of this. You are reviewing samples that come back. I was just over in the Panda Game Manufacturing talk, and you're getting a lot of details about the way they do things for that. Booking freight. Now I'm going to stop there because this list goes on and on. And as I've said, my involvement, dramatically reduced in this part. A lot of folks from Flat Out and AEG, they're going through these parts and making it to the finish line, if you will. So this is my favorite slide in the deck. I think it was somebody floated this idea, Randy and Elizabeth should get up and talk about what it takes to win Spiel. And I was just like, oh no. That might be Elizabeth doing a lot of talking. So
I have the same answer.
There you go. Yeah, it's complicated, and it's mathematical and political and social, and I could just go on. And so it's very, very hard to get your mind wrapped around. Like every little thing has an impact, and it's hard to know what that impact is in particular, like cost of a game. It's much less likely that a $20 game is going to win the Spiel Jahres for various reasons. Doesn't make it impossible. It's happened, and it will probably happen again, but how do you compute that in there? I don't know. So I wrote down a couple of things. I have a bunch of notes here. I don't have to go through, but as you've probably heard me going through this process, I talk a lot about the collab and everyone involved, and just talking about the reviewing and all of this. I think most good games take a lot of people with a lot of hands on it, from different angles and different skills and different abilities and different experiences. And I really got to experience seeing that in Cascadia. I've seen it a bit with Debris as well, in the different things that go on. So I think that's actually really, really important. And for the Cascadia, for the collab, you basically had 7 people who really cared about this product. Even people who were just there as development, not part of the company and not me. They really, really cared about this product getting out there and making sure it was the best it could be. So the Flat Out is, Molly, Sean, and Rob, they're the principals, the owners of Flat Out, plus Dylan Mangini, Kevin Russ, and David Yetzi, all game designers. Dylan is also a graphic designer, and Kevin Russ has done a lot of rulebook work, also very good on the graphic design and arrangement side. David is actually an amazing game designer, and myself. And so that's your collab. One person not necessarily part of the collab, but also equally critical, is Beth Vogel. I get to see a lot of the back and forth between Molly and Sean and Rob and Beth on the art and all of that. And I am sure the best games, again, is going to feel collaborative with how the art goes. You get something from the artist. Well, what did you tell them you wanted? What did they deliver to you? If it's not exactly what you were thinking, why is it not? Not, this isn't what we want. Oh, that doesn't meet our bar. What does the artist do with that? Probably get annoyed. And so there's that collaborative process going on, and understanding the personalities you're working with and what they're good at, what they're bad at. And I've seen even more of that with Debris, where we've had multiple illustrators and multiple people working on the graphic design. And I've been able to provide a lot of feedback along the way with that, and going and seeing how that works and how people collaborate. And so, very, very important. The second part of this is published in Germany during that year. That's it's like anyone knows the Academy Awards, Grammys, whatever. There's a period that something has to be out, and there's other requirements about that. In Germany, it's pretty specific. It's pretty specific and simple, and I might even get the simple slightly wrong. It's published in Germany during this period, and that's key. Published in Germany. So a lot of you may know that Cryptid was nominated for the Kenner Spiel this past year. This is a 2018 game, right? But it wasn't published in Germany until in that period. I don't know exactly 2021 or 2022, but it was that during the period. So keep that in mind when you see the awards and something seems oddly out of sync, but it's an old game. It matters, it was published in Germany. But this is why your German publisher is important, right? Your German publisher is probably the company that understands this better than anyone. Cosmos, being a relatively large, old German publisher, understands this very well. They almost won the previous year with Robin Hood. And so I think having them as a partner was actually very, very important. And so you've got Flat Out partnering with AEG. AEG does a great job of signing international partners. So, while it needs to be published in Germany, believe me, worldwide acclaim is a big driver of that. We're going to pay attention to that. I believe Cascadia is available in 20 to 24 different languages now, so in many, many countries. And one thing I can't remember if I mentioned it earlier, but on the Cosmos front, just to tell you how focused they are and how good they are at things, they actually sought out Cascadia. This wasn't the AEG saying, hey, Cosmos, do you want to publish this? They came to us. In fact, they tried coming to us from every angle of the country. Flat Out, to me, they come to this. Because one of their key developers had singled out Cascadia as this is the most important non-German game we need to sign this year. As an aside, the folks from Cosmos are awesome. I got to spend a bunch of time with them during the award ceremony and a little bit more at Essen, and I really, really, really like the company of people. There we are. said you always write down a lot of questions, right? I see Sarah wrote down a bunch of stuff. Hopefully it's not notes on her game. Yeah, feel free to ask me anything about what's been presented or thoughts. Tam, Scoon, I don't know if there's a way you want to do this.
I can run the microphone back and forth. But first of all, can we get just a quick round of applause for just taking us from the prototype to the Spiel. Any particular questions for Randy about any part of this process or about the design?
You kind of addressed it a little when you were discussing a like game to Cascadia, but now that it is published and it's out there, how do you tend to approach or respond when you come across games, published or not, that bear many, many similarities? An example I have was the game Overboss that I have, which when we play it, they're different, but they're very similar too.
I have actually two very different answers to give you on those because of your example. So first off, I feel like I can go through a catalog of let's say you show me 10 games within a certain category. I don't want to see Point Salad and Twilight Imperium 4 now this, but there's something similar. And you give me 20 minutes, and I'll go through the books and all that, and I will be able to point out to you a huge amount of similarities in those games. Individual mechanics imported in, thematically driving something in a very similar way. It gets a lot into, how do you define innovation? Even, there's always been, coming from the software world, there's a lot of discussion about that. There are companies that get noted as innovators. Like I'll use an example of Apple, used to be like the key innovator, and I don't necessarily disagree with that. I mean, there was a period where they were the key innovator. And yet, almost all of the innovations, during that period came from Xerox. They weren't actually invented by Apple. Apple did a different set of things with those technical capabilities that Xerox never did. So, I think you should expect that. You should expect that, and I think it's absolutely fine. Related to that, there have been a couple of things come out recently. For those that are on the Twitter community and have seen it, there are games that really end up being copies. Maybe a rethemed, thing where they either made no changes or almost none. Of course, I think this is awful, and it's someone taking advantage of both another company's work and a designer's work, and probably a lot of other people's work. Legally, I'm not the one to talk on that, but I know it's a gray area at times. The things that you can patent or copyright or various things in games is actually pretty darn limited. So, how you approach that, I don't know. I've never seen any game myself that I felt like infringed on Cascadia, despite similarities. I'm sure you can go back to games before Cascadia and make some very similar connections. I know that. But to your example, Overboss is designed by Aaron Mesburn and Kevin Russ, both members of Seattle Tabletop Games community. Overboss came from a design, I might have been called Solera at the time, and all I'm saying is that paired drafting bit and it came from essentially the same group. We never talked about it. Never talked about it. Like it just kind of naturally happened. So I can't even tell you what was the history of those similarities. But it doesn't surprise me at all. We're talking about those things. So there is a lot of similarity. I think we're lucky that there's actually some key differences as well. And thematically, they're nothing alike. I enjoy Overboss. I have Overboss. We've played it a number of times. I think it has some advantages in terms of the scoring and the dynamism that goes on in it that's a little leveled up from Cascadia. I think the setup a little harder with Overboss. It takes a little more commitment, for me to get to the table. And I think they're both great games. Now you fast forward to Verdant, also from Aaron Mesburn, Kevin Russ, and Molly and Sean. Actually came from the same game. So games morph, games split, ideas go in multiple directions. And so it's a little harder to look at Verdant and see the connections, but they're there. There's some very, very similar things. I think Verdict comes across as the most different for a variety of reasons, a lot of work on doing some things differently. But there are still similarities between them. If that answers your question.
Oh, totally. I appreciate it.
Any other questions?
From a publishing angle, it sounded from listening to your talk, you had, especially being friends with Flat Out, like a lot of view into the development process, the artwork process, a lot of the different things. Same thing for Debris. It sounds like there was a lot of like the publisher kind of giving you a lot of insight and a lot of like views and everything like that. And in general, I'm curious of if that's something that you feel as a designer is very important to you, or something that you feel is nice to have, and just your kind of viewpoint into when a publisher takes the game and is making changes and decisions and components and tweaks and development and artwork, how much your internally you feel like you should be a part of the process, or you feel like you are just enjoy that part of the process.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. That's a really good question. And I, from an actual publication standpoint, I don't have a huge variety of experiences to draw from yet. Although I talk with people a lot, I'm aware of similar, friends who've had similar experiences to me, and friends who've had very different experiences from me. All the way to, we dropped the game with the publisher, they didn't talk to us for a year, and then we saw that it was being released, and it had changes. Like, never once talked to the designer. So I've seen, those ends. For me personally, my preference would simply be that the publisher talk to me about that up front, right? If they really don't expect me to be involved, don't want me to be very involved, I'd like them to tell me that up front. And honestly, it's going to depend on the game. I would have had a hard time with Debris being detached. And I talked about that with Crafty at the time, with that. And they were very much like, you be involved as much as you want. Now keep in mind, some of this is going to be free labor for you on the designer standpoint, so you have to make that decision as well. There are other models that can want. Obviously, the flat out model is very different because it's not free labor with them. But that did drive what I did on Debris, though. I spent time, but there were certain rabbit holes I did not go down because I knew that's a lot of time, and they're hiring people to do this kind of work, and I should let them do that work and just minimize my time giving them feedback. It didn't hurt that I had met John Grieger before and knew, his capabilities and knew that he would take my emails and call at any point. So I felt very, very good about that collaboration. So for Debris, it was very important. For Cascadia, it's just the whole flat out, the collab experience is just very different. Like it was just part and parcel. There wasn't really any choice. I can imagine myself being very happy being totally detached with certain games. There were games where I'd be like, I've got designs, like someone wants to take this and say, we got it, we got some stuff we're going to do to it, hey, we can give you an update every now and then. I'm going to be like, great, I'm happy with that. And I can imagine other ones coming along like, I'm not sure I want to let that happen. I want to at least be informed enough along the way and be given the chance to speak up, when things are going away, I think is not ideal. So for me, it's a range of things. I know a number of designers who could care less. They finish their work. As long as the publisher doesn't destroy the game, they don't really care. Get it out there, do it. So, and I've seen a variety of experiences with that. I know the one I talked about showed up a year later and they made changes. They just didn't really care that much. I think the changes actually hurt the game myself, which is a personal opinion. But I also don't think it mattered. I don't think it mattered for sales. I don't think it mattered for much of anything in that game. It was more of a party game, which is its own different beast with different mechanisms. So I know that there are publishers who simply don't do that. I've heard tales of multiple people working at certain publishers. They're the kind that you're just not going to hear from them. You're all of a sudden going to get something at the very end, and that's there. And most people I know have. They just resign themselves to that. Okay, that's the way it is. So, I like it. I like having that touch. I like having that time. I like learning from that. I mean, I've talked to some folks about that, when I pitch games or when I talk to certain industry folks about the possibility of games, sometimes I let them know, I probably know more about your business than most designers who pitch to you, and that this conversation is going to reflect that. I'm going to ask questions that many designers wouldn't. I think it's good or bad. Just for me, it's how it is, and I would like to know more about that. So I've learned a lot about that from being more involved in these processes and seeing the trade-offs that get made and why and what goes on. I think it makes me a better designer. I think it makes me understand how to make certain decisions earlier at the right time to say, hey, this is actually cool, but you know what? If I actually think through what it's going to take to publish this, it actually might be a speed bump, and maybe it's not really worth it. So I'm very happy with what I've learned from seeing that part of the process.
Oh, we have a couple more. Excellent. Let's go somebody randomly this way first.
How important do you think it was attaching the specific theme of Pacific Northwest to the game, as opposed to if it had just been more like the lands and animals kind of theme you had originally?
I'm not going to say that Cascadia couldn't have been like the same level of success with a different, more generic or more traditional, wildlife theme. I'm sure it could have if done well. But I think there are a couple things. One, sticking with the fact that it's wildlife. Somebody in this room helped, move along this move to really include nature themes in games. And I'm not going to deny it. At some point, it's riding on those coattails. It's riding on the wave that is. And so I think, sticking nature themes. You saw the note that I had originally. I had things like, it could be cities, it could be this, it could be that. So I think that's a case where the timing was really, really good, and we never doubted that. The second part comes from how do you distinguish your game? How do you make it call out? Especially if a lot of people are following this wave, saying let's create some nature-based games. How do you make yours stand out? And we didn't have any big thing. It's like, well, it's still just wildlife and habitats, and people have seen this in other games. But we weren't aware of a lot of games that were focused on the Pacific Northwest. In fact, often they don't really even focus on regions. That's changed a little bit. There's games that are parks and other things that say, oh, we're focusing here, we're focusing there. And so I think we felt like it was a really good choice. And the other, maybe harder to wrap my head around at times, though, is the passion that we put into it, being as our region, as opposed to it being picked, the Rocky Mountains, I think that we all actually cared about the theme a lot. And I mean, we debated, animals a lot. So we're debating, should it be an elk? Should it be this? Should it be that? And there were very few people in that co-op who didn't care, that they had an opinion. This is our area. We know this. How we really want cougars in the game. God, can we get cougars in the game? I'm unfortunately, where cougars are, the scoring mechanism thematically is ridiculous. It doesn't make any sense. And that's when elk came in. Because actually the things we have for this actually seem to match to what elk actually do. Whereas for cougars it was just totally wrong. So I think there was a lot of passion because of the choice as well. And then we put an elk on the cover, which I don't think was anyone's expected choice, because we had a choice of foxes, we had bears, these are animals people gravitate to. I actually don't know who made the choice to put the elk on the cover. It might have been Beth. And again, simple decision that helped the game stand out. It didn't look like the other nature games, bringing things in here. I actually think about Wingspan's cover. I think Wingspan's cover is genius. It doesn't look like much of the rest of the game, but it just stands out. It just pops. All I needed was this bird. It's a gorgeous bird. It's really well done. That's it. A little bit of that, and so I think it helped it stand out in that way too.
I want to build on that question a little bit. Something you didn't mention in your talk. You mentioned flat out folks being in the Pacific Northwest and yourself, but Beth is also in the Pacific Northwest, right?
Yes, she is.
And so, I know about the very beautiful River and Stone project and kind of her feeling toward the Pacific Northwest. Was that influential too in kind of the art style and design there?
Well, if you go back in the talk when I said to them, well, Beth's going to do the art, right? Yes. We're going to ask her to do the art because she did Calico, but it wasn't just that. It was this. I mean, I had met Beth several times. She lives, just a couple hours north. Beth walks out. She posts pictures of her gorgeous walks, around her area, and she paints nature very well. So yes, I was quite confident that Beth would, share in that passion for it, and I think that really shows as well. So absolutely.
Yeah. All right. Did you still have a question over here?
Yeah,
Not quick on the spot.
Yeah, sure.
Try to keep in my head.
Thank you. So you mentioned when you built the AI system that kind of helped finesse some of the numbers and all of that kind of stuff. I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about what that process looked like for you.
You're talking about the solo mode?
Yeah.
Solo modes are fascinating, and for many games they're almost a different skill set. If you look around at boxes for games that have solo mode, you'll often find the solo mode is not designed by the key designer of the game. It's very, very common. And you'll also notice names show up again and again, especially within a company. Often they end up with a go-to person for this. Most of that, though, is because solo modes do require, you said it, AI. And it's a little bit of a loaded term, but the point is they're trying to mimic a decision process going on somewhere. And if you look at Tabriz has a solo mode that I had nothing to do with. It's somewhat complex, but also takes advantage of the parts of the game with the dice moving it along. And that's what it does. It actually has 5 different rivals, and they all behave a little bit differently in the way that they try to stop you. But that's not Cascadia's solo mode. Cascadia's solo mode is just what's going to happen after you draft your tiles to what's left. That's really it. And that's why it's so simple. It's kind of genius. There's a certain set of things that it doesn't do. I say it doesn't change the game in terms of setting an environment, which is the beauty of it for playtesting, and the beauty of it for anyone who just wants to do it and try it out. But one thing it doesn't do is create that tension in the draft where someone might take what you want. In fact, it's entirely the opposite. Yes, it's like a 2-player game in that you're going to lose one other set of tiles, but you know what they're going to be. You know what they're going to be before you even draft your tiles. So you might make a different decision based on what's going to happen to the market because of what you see there. And so that's the one real twist that it puts on the game. So from my perspective, it was just nice that the setting and the environment didn't change. But for these kinds of games like Cascadia, you've got to think about that whole AI-driven thing. With Tabriz, you have to roll dice, you have to move them and do various things. It's not super complicated, but compared to Cascadia, yeah, it's complicated. Most people who play Cascadia are not going to put up with that kind of stuff. It has to be that simple. And I imagine that some games of that complexity, they never find anything that works. So I think with Cascadia we did. I think Calico and Verdant also have very similar. Although I think Cascadia might be the most straightforward of those solo modes. And this is really about the question you asked, but why are we seeing more solo modes now? We didn't used to see all that many of them. Specific games. Kickstarter is why you see more solo modes today. Every time you go to some company that focuses on doing Kickstarters and helping with Kickstarters, one of the top several things in their list is solo mode. The numbers of people playing solo mode, sure, they've gone up. They skyrocketed. It's just that the people who pledge on Kickstarter, there's just a much higher percentage of them, and they're loud. And so they can be a problem, or they can be wonderful if you put that in. They can be great ambassadors for your game. And so it becomes much more important to have a solo mode when you're on Kickstarter. It's not like it's required. There are other ways around it, but it's much more helpful. When you go into a store, I guarantee you 99 out of 100 people looking at those boxes on the store never check for a solo mode. More than 99 out of 100. The vast majority just don't care. But in Kickstarter, it's different.
Right. So we have one over here.
I was just curious when you mentioned killing your darlings. During the design process, is there a point at which you realize this mechanic is just not working anymore? Is there a rule for how many tests you'll give it before you shelve it? Or does it always take an external influence to be like, this really is not working, you should give up?
It's a really good question that I may not have the most satisfying answer for. I think it's very hard. I mean, the whole reason that there's a metaphor like "kill your darlings" is it's hard. And I think designers who probably crank out a lot of good designs quickly, I'm guessing they're really good at this. I think it's probably a key skill to be able to get designs out regularly, because they really can hang you up, and you may never know it. You're not getting over a hump because what do I need to add? What do I need to change? You don't even realize that it's your favorite part of the game that is actually holding you back. That's hard. I love the Wilds in Cascadia. I still do. I had to hear it again and again and again. And I was never heard like these suck. No one ever said like this isn't a good mechanic. Almost everyone said something that was like, this is a cool mechanic. It's not helping your game. And I had to hear that multiple times. And Emma was the first one, I think, who just forceful about it. She's like, I guarantee you need to do this. And so I heard that before that. I don't have an answer to the number of times, to any of this. Like I said, in Cascadia, it just got to a point where all the other mechanics had made it unnecessary, so I could get rid of it. It probably wouldn't have worked. If I tried to get rid of it too early, the game might have just fallen apart. And by the time I did, it was the opposite. So I don't really have a great answer for when, but it's a good thing to keep in mind. When you're designing games, it's like, who are you designing it for? Is a part of this equation. And it's easy to design games for yourself. There's nothing wrong with that. If your goal is to publish a lot of games, that will likely be an impediment, unless you have a really broad mind at looking at things. It can be very difficult. You really need to think about your audience. You need to think about what's going to cause them problems, what's going to give them joy, and sometimes the things that make it wonderful for you are actually going to be an impediment for them, or just not an impediment, but they just don't care. And so suddenly you have this relatively complex thing in your game that is really cool, and yet most of your audience could care less about it. Well, your game could be simpler, probably help it sell more, probably get more people playing it if it's simpler. So, it's not easy.
Everyone back here.
I guess two questions. One is just more of a rehash because I wasn't here for the part where you had the slide that said board games, video games, board game. So I was hoping to get like a general, quick hit of what you meant by that part. And then an actual question would be, what sort of type of game, not overall build, but just style of game, do you think you'd want to work on for your next project?
So I'll say, as far as the rehash is concerned, a lot of these are recorded as well. Sam can correct me if I'm wrong there. But I'd also love an expansion there, right? You mentioned Halo and Civilization, but if there are other video games, you mentioned achievements, right? If there are other sort of specific video games or video game tropes that are influential.
On the rehash part, that part was about sort of my history with games. I played some board and card games as a kid, and then when I was in college, I migrated towards video games. Firstly, PC games, things like Civilization, SimCity, games like that were really my favorite. They fit in with me being a builder, building stuff up. And then it was when I met my partner and her son, now my son, that I jumped into board games, and that's what really led me to where I am today, and that was about 11 years ago. So that was kind of the game and coming back. So that was really it. On the video games, to me, what I think of in this jump is like the SimCity, Civilization. I mean, I played a bunch of related games to that, and I think it's kind of interesting that when there were games that had real-time or turn-based modes, I always played the turn-based modes. That was just more interesting to me to pause, think, what do I want to do next, go. Which, board game world, this is much more fitting in. And so, that was kind of a journey there. When it comes to Xbox, it was the platform I was on. I mean, Destiny is the last game that I played a lot of on the Xbox. FIFA, one outside of the loop. I played about 5 versions of FIFA, a lot. But video games became different for me when I was on the Xbox. Yes, I did campaigns like Halo and Destiny and all of that, but really it was the mindless, fighting against other people that I ended up gravitating towards, which I find funny because it's not really, doesn't really fit in with much else that I do. But it was a very different thing for me. Just sit down, get 10 minutes, there's not a lot of thinking and strategy, just react. I did, which is probably why I was never actually very good at them. I enjoyed them, but I was not one of the better players. Yeah. As far as like the kind of game I want to design for my next game, my approach so far has been to jump genres as far as mechanics go. And so I am trying to learn. And so I pick up new things. I spent about a year developing a railroad game with Aaron Mesburn. Not signed for various reasons, but wonderful experience. So much that I've learned from that and enjoyed it greatly. Yes, I play railroad games, but not a ton. I have a design in progress that's area control, not something, again, that I've done. Also, a mechanic that is hard for me to enjoy at times. There are area control games I love, but it's like, small percentage, like they have to hit certain things. And so, well, can I make one that I would love? So I like, moving, through those. I will tell you my favorite game, and it's been so for about 5 years, is Concordia. And these kind of Euro trading, moving cubes around on the board games are when they're good, I just love them. And so it's definitely a kind of game I've spent some time on, but not enough designing, and would like to design some there. So yeah, that's my approach.
Hands. Hey, how about the flip side then? Are there mechanics or sort of packages of mechanics, games that you wouldn't, like, I just have no interest in ever making a roll and write? No, that's okay.
Social deduction. Don't really enjoy playing many of them very much. Would not know how to think about them, and sure, that could be true of some other types, but some I also don't really have much interest in figuring that out. Which I find interesting because it doesn't mean I'm not interested in designing games that have intrigue and hidden information. Like that actually, I have a design from earlier when I started designing I really want to come back to someday that is a lot about what's the hidden information, how do I bluff my way out of it and stuff like that. Like that I actually find very interesting, but when it actually comes to pure social deduction, Blood on the Clock Tower, story-based games like that, and Werewolf and this kind of stuff, like Two Rooms and a Boom, like these things, like I've played them and I vibrate nervously while doing so, and I'm usually not on the winning side, and I don't think I'd want to design that kind of game. So I appreciate the games in a way, and I appreciate the people who like to play them. I actually listen a lot to people like on Instagram and others talk about why they enjoy these games or how they go, and I'm kind of fascinated by it, but it never draws me to want to play it or design. So,
yeah. Any last questions? So we got another one right here. Okay.
Yeah. So you mentioned audience being really important, like knowing who your audience is when making a game. I don't know if you went over like what you had in mind for Cascadia, but like, did you have an audience in mind when making Cascadia?
as soon as you started answering the question, I was like reflecting on what I said there and how that worked out for my games, and I realized one thing. I am this focus. As I just said, I focused on like, well, let me try this kind of game. Let me try developing this kind of mechanic, this level of game, etc. Honestly, at that stage, I'm not thinking about audience. I'm really thinking, can I make this game? So I realized that part of it is about when do I start thinking about audience. I can imagine doing a design that's like a passion for what it is, and I don't care about the audience except myself. Like I can see that happening. It has not yet. And so there comes a point where I'm like, who are my players? Like, who am I expecting to play this game, and what's going to motivate them to play this game? And so that's when I start, thinking about it. With Cascadia, there were probably points in this game, like especially back when the Wilds were in, when I could have gone a different direction for audience and made it more complex. And so there was that point where I like had to decide, and I think I'd already pretty much figured out that like, no, this has to be a relatively straightforward game. The more I can strip it down and yet still have it be tense and fun, the better. And so that's kind of vague, but nonetheless, it puts you in that kind of family weight game, you know, and something, and that helps tell you something about the game. If Cascadia took an hour for 3 players to play, that would be too much. I'm not saying some people don't play it in an hour and 3 players, because this is one of the problems with time. My own family group, if the game says it plays in 45 minutes, we take an hour and a half. And that's a lot of reasons, but some of it is how much socialization do you do during the game. So there's a lot of reasons. But the point is, Cascadia could have gone in a different direction, but because I realized no, it's a family weight game, it meant certain things. It meant not many more tiles. You know, we can cut back, but we can't add. Cascadia these may seem like small numbers, and they are, but like Cascadia was 21 to 23 tiles played for much of its time after the board was gone. In the end, we cut it to 20 to get to a round number, but actually more importantly for manufacturing, because how many punch boards are in here? You know, Sean's like, if we have 20, we got this nicely solved. If we need to stick with 21, we got some work to do. And so we tried it at 20. It required a few scoring card tweaks, but overall work. But if he had said, let's try 25, I think someone on the team would have said, really? You know, are we really wanting to add time given the audience we've chosen? So, you know, I think you've got to decide when that matters. But once you've realized it, you need to pay attention to it. You need to not make decisions that go against that.
Thank you.
We have one last question here.
What was your focus like for working on this project? Like, did you maintain just like sole focus on this until you got it pitched and signed, or were you bouncing back and forth? And like, essentially, how do you start a project and actually, you know, make sure the game gets to completion?
For this project, I'll give you the answer. I don't know how enlightening it will be in general, so I'll say something more after that. But for this one, I got very focused on it after coming up with the idea. So for 2.5 months, this was my primary focus. It didn't mean I didn't work on other games. I did work on my role in like some, I did this and that. But the vast majority of my truly creative energy went into Cascadia. And that's great. And so it's great that I got it signed with Flat Out, at the end of that period. And I pushed it aside for a month. Like, it was great to be able to do that because I know the mental energy that focus takes. And I work like that in general, that it's very hard for me to have my core creative energy pulled between multiple projects. I do work on multiple projects at once, but they need to be in somewhat different stages or I struggle. There's a lot of getting in and getting out of a design that takes time and effort. I write a lot of stuff down. I record a lot of stuff, and yet still I'll come back in the game and I'll actually forget why I was doing something. So I find it difficult to focus hard creatively on that. Now, if I have a game that the core mechanics are set and I'm tweaking, things and numbers and times and various things while doing something like focusing hard on something like I did Cascadia, that can actually work very, very well. My mind needs a break from the creativity, so it's like, what are these different processes I can do? Or maybe I need a physical prototype for something that's already working. That's a very different process for me to go through. And so I try to parallelize, but I try to parallelize between different kinds of tasks. And I've actually been going through that recently where I've had 3 different projects, and one of them I just had to put on the back burner. And I mean, this is something that is a project that I have external deadlines and stuff for, I have to do. But it's like, I really can't focus on more than one of these at once. And so instead, I wrapped up and said, serialize that part of the process. I'm getting the first one done, I'm getting the second one done, and this. And I didn't adhere to that 100%, but pretty close. And that really turned out to be the right strategy because I got the first 2 done on time. and now I'm able to focus on the third after this. So.
All right. So any last closing remarks or advice?
I don't know if I have really had a great set of questions. So thank you, and thank you for giving that great set of questions. I was hoping to be able to answer things that people wanted to know about the process. So that's been fantastic. I don't know that I have a ton more to say about Cascadia, but I prepared one last slide. Just curious, can I get a show of hands who do you know what this is about? Sort of a few, yeah. I'm not surprised by that result. This is the bubbles we get into, and this is the world we live in, where huge major events happen and people don't know because there's so much going on. Talked about Tabriz, and talked about how I lived in Iran. Well, Iran is in the middle of a revolution. It's not always presented that way because it's not guns in the streets at this point, but it is citizens being killed by the government. And this slogan is a Kurdish slogan that was adopted by Iranians because the first woman killed in this was Kurdish. And it means woman, life, freedom, Zan Zendagi Azadi, woman, life, freedom. And the art you see at the bottom is from the artist for Tabriz. He has been using his creative outlet to draw something. Sorry to be down on this, but every child there has been killed. He drew them after they were killed. So I don't really have a ton of point to this except to say there's a lot going on in the world. There's a lot of bad things in the world. It's very hard to focus on all of them. I don't expect people to. But our media does a horrible job at picking and choosing which ones to show you. And that's really sad. So Woman Life Freedom, I encourage you, if you don't know much about it, at least look it up. And one other thing I would encourage you there is if you learn about it, you see how bad it is because it's bad. It's good to reflect back on our country and what goes on here that is similar. So I'm not even giving any details there because I think most people are smart enough to understand that we have various groups that get marginalized and get killed because of who they are. It happens here just as much as it happens there, even though it's very different. Thank you.
Thank you, Randy. I mean, Ben has already made this joke about Spiel des Jahres winner, first Elizabeth, and then Randy, and what Spiel des Jahres winner from Unpub is going to be next year's special guest. Maybe they're here, maybe that game is here. But yeah, I just appreciate you using your platform in this way and also sharing your story today. So one more round of applause for Randy.
That's a good one. Like,